Schneider Electric is the proud sponsor of this podcast series. A core value for Schneider, for both its employees and customers, is to learn every day. They trust the following will provide some learning for you today.
My name is Jo Taranto and I'm joined today by Peter Carroll, Service Line Leader, Water Treatment and Desalination at GHD. And we're going to be talking about water supply security and resilience for manufactured water. Welcome, Peter.
Thanks, Jo. It's a pleasure to be here.
Peter, what made you interested in a career in water?
It's a good question. I didn't quite know what I wanted to do. I fell into engineering out of school. Felt like I wanted to make a positive difference. I liked chemistry. I studied chemical engineering, only to find it was a very heavily petrochemical-focused degree. I did vac work at an oil refinery whilst at university, and technically I found it very interesting and challenging. Didn't quite sit right with me working in that industry. So I subsequently did vacation work with one of the water corps in Melbourne, and I found that was a better fit for me personally. Provided that opportunity I could see to make some kind of, call it positive contribution to our community.
And that positive contribution, Peter's come to focus on water supplies. How important is it for the Australian context?
Look, I think it's critical. Early in my career, I started at GHD as a graduate in 2006, and that was sort of as the Millennium Drought was really stepping in, roaring up. Through just by coincidence of where I sat in an office, I ended up working on the Victorian Desalination Project from feasibility right through to its delivery, and saw firsthand how close the state, or Melbourne, went to its own day zero situation, how close we were to running out of water, and the way that a drastic measure was needed in the form of big infrastructure to address that. And that was sort of my first exposure to that question of what does water supply mean for our communities. And we saw a lot of, I think everyone who was will remember the water restrictions we all faced at that time, the short showers, the public messaging about saving water, the limited use on your gardens. But really it was the wider community impacts. It was the fact that sports fields were unplayable because you couldn't water them. A lot of this public social infrastructure was totally put to side for a few years because we just didn't have the water to maintain it. So I see that there's a huge need for maintaining. I mean, we have the ability to do it, to maintain our water supplies sufficiently that we can maintain the things in our lives that are important and in our society that gives it its meaning.
And when you talk about manufactured water, Peter, is that just desalination or does it include other things?
I like to use the manufactured water as an umbrella for all the sources of water that think of them having as an anthropogenic source, if you will. Like it's a supply of water that humans are able to produce from what's around them and not be necessarily reliant on the natural cycles that we are currently, largely relying on to do with rainfall and capturing the stream flow in rivers, in dams and reservoirs. Manufactured water in that sense really comes down to two things. Seawater desalination. We've got, if you buy the coast, you have an infinite supply of water there. It's just not of the right quality. And water recycling. As long as we're using water, we're creating wastewater, and that wastewater can be reused safely and for higher purposes than it is today.
And what role does manufactured water then play in our natural water cycle?
Look, in the natural water cycle, it's the recycling component of it may have significant benefits for, and it's a case-by-case situation here, but avoiding the discharge of wastewater into the environment or reducing it by being able to reuse that water has a big benefit by it's not impacting the downstream ecosystems that would be affected. It means that water provides some economic benefit if it's used in agriculture or recycling. And really what that means is we're not taking some other source of water out of the environment somewhere else. From a desalination perspective, if done correctly in the right locations, it should be neutral with respect to the natural water cycle. something that I remember doing when we were thinking about the Victorian desalination project is we tried to estimate, thinking of it as the equivalent of an extra amount of evaporation from the ocean and how much extra area of ocean does it equate to. And it was minuscule in the scheme of things. Just the immense, like I said before, it's an essentially infinite reservoir sitting there, and we just need to find the right locations to be able to extract that water so that we can treat it, and that gives us our fresh water supply.
What work is GHD doing around supply security and resilience?
So we're doing plenty in this space, and it'd be hard to distill it into a neat answer. A lot of what we do relates to the specifics of projects. We've been heavily involved in desalination projects across Australia, and particularly in the United States more recently, and we're seeing the interest in desalination ramp up at the moment in Australia again, as I think governments and departments are looking to, when does the next El Nino cycle hit? Are we potentially going to hit another dry cycle like we did in the early 2000s? The lead time on these projects and what's needed. So we do a lot of work in that project space, but we've also taken on some initiatives internally. We've got a step up initiative that we've got our futures. We've got 3 of them: future energy, future of water, and future communities. And within future of water, this is where the business is investing in concepts and ideas that will add value to the market and to our clients. And a couple of them here really tie in nicely with this whole question. There's a whole piece around strategic water planning, which really comes back to the question of mapping out how to make sure we keep the water supply and demand balance in the black, and the timing that is needed on these projects, how to approach them in a way and identify the trigger points to do certain actions, and also giving yourself fallback options if new information comes to light or something else happens, so that you've always got a way forward through this, and that's our adaptive planning framework. We also do. We're also got an initiative within Future of Water that's tied to circular economy, and the water recycling piece and the use of purified recycled water, PRW, I see has been really central to that, to both circular economy and the strategic water planning question.
You're listening to the Australian Water Association podcast series, and I'm speaking with Peter Carroll from GHD. What are the things that people need to think about when they are making choices around manufactured water then, Peter?
I think if I take this from a purely technical level, it's really just it depends on your specific situation. So it depends on your location. Are you near the coast? So that answer is seawater desalination even on the table, noting that there may be groundwater desalination too. Purified recycled water at a technical level, I guess, is potentially available anywhere. It is, at the end of the day, provides a resource that is linked to the consumption of water in the first instance. So you're able to really close the loop there. So it's something that I guess is on the table technically everywhere. I guess where the limitations start to come in and where we start to question what you do is what's the acceptance look like? Acceptance is broad. Like on one hand, what does like the regulators say in the jurisdiction, like the health regulator, environmental regulators and the like? But also really I think that is central to this question, particularly when we start going into recycling, people get very interested in is what's the community say? Is there community acceptance for that scheme? Are they willing to have these other sources brought into their conventional supplies? And then, of course, all of this comes together. Like at the end of the day, we need to try and identify projects that are cost efficient. They can be provided in the scale needed for the challenge ahead of us. So, on one hand, a desalination project might provide any scale we want, provided you can pay for the infrastructure. But on a PRW project, you will be inherently limited to the amount of wastewater that is generated from that population to start with. So I guess, look, they've both got scope for application, but there's limitations on both, and it depends is where I'd always go.
You just touched on it then. There's a lot of sensitivities when you come, particularly talking about I guess, recycled water or purified recycled water. But even desal has at times been a hot topic for communities and, for regulators, I guess, too. What are some of the misconceptions that you see popping up when these topics are discussed?
Okay. Toilet to tap. Let's just start there. Like that's the phrase that famously sunk a potable reuse scheme in San Diego. Toowoomba as the shorthand for the proposed recycling in Toowoomba during the Millennium Drought. The emotive arguments that get made around purified recycled water in particular, they get traction and they seem to take a bit of a life of their own. So I guess there is a need with to make sure that ahead of that becoming the narrative, that there's enough community dialogue and understanding at a community level about the water cycle and what these sources actually entail, and the incredible amount of treatment and barriers that are put in place between the toilet and the tap, so that it is not you can't draw that line between the two necessarily. Within purified recycled water, there's other things that I think get misunderstood. Indirect potable reuse is the way that it's typically being done in Australia and elsewhere where it is done. That's where we have an environmental buffer where we put the water through, and that offers a number of advantages to, from a treatment perspective, it gives you some time and scope for margin for error, basically. But it also means that you are breaking that linkage, and it helps a lot. Direct potable reuse, however, often has a lot of advantages on a project basis. It looks cheaper. There's less transfer infrastructure involved typically, especially if there's not a suitable aquifer. But it might be oversold if the system doesn't have diversity of supply, and it is actually needs to be able to reliably draw on that as a resource on a peak day. The other misconception I'll just draw to come to now is one of my favourites is the energy thing. Now, desalination is energy intensive. There's no doubt about it. I was out at the Sydney desal plant yesterday, and the scale of some of the electrical infrastructure there is immense. But we need to think about it in perspective. The energy use to create desalinated water, yes, it's higher than our conventional sources, but in the scheme of our modern lifestyles, it's small. And the Sydney desal plant will draw something like 40 megawatts of energy, of power, when it's operating at full capacity. And I'll just draw put the comparison out, is that's what a 747 uses when it's at cruise. So you could have, call it 500 people flying across the Pacific at 40 megawatts, or you could have water for 1 million people. So I think bringing it back to some perspective is useful. The energy use is high, but it's, in the scheme of modern life, it's low. And purified recycled water is lower again, although it has some other challenges.
I guess there's also a role that desal can play as part of other potential energy sources in the future too, so that it really plays, I guess, that part in a whole bunch of green hydrogen and a whole bunch of other conversations too, right? It
does, exactly. So you've taken the words out of my mouth. Green hydrogen, if assuming that gets legs, which signs are pointing to yes, there'll be a huge demand for new sources of water to meet both the feedstock input that you need to the water to create the hydrogen from, but also the cooling water and other services that a hydrogen production facility will need. And that's going to need a scale of water supply equivalent to our current urban demands. And where's it going to come from? Like the existing natural sources are all allocated or already overstressed. There's not spare water, so to speak, in Australia at least. So the ocean is in my view, at least, the logical place that would come from.
So how do we navigate community acceptance then, if it is really the difference between success and failure? Are there any tips on how you can do this well?
I'm a lowly engineer, so
get in early.
I've got that written here in my notes. It's about getting in early, start early with a clear plan for engagement. I'm not the expert on this by any stretch of the imagination, but I would point to the past work or recent work by WASA that's looked at this as part of their all options on the table reports. Through that, there's, I think, a need for a clear plan for early engagement and clear communication and the community education piece that comes with it. But what I found really interesting in that work is that I think that the community is ahead of our political leadership in many ways on questions like this. The general acceptance of the idea of recycling for consumption was high, and it was in some instances, or quite often I think in that report, higher than desalination. The political situation in Australia, when you look around the state governments and their views on recycled water, it doesn't match that. So I think in that sense, the community is ahead of our political leadership. You know, the politicians are the lagging indicator here.
Well, look, arguably not the first time.
This is now a politics podcast.
I wanted to see where you think the future is for, manufactured water in Australia. What do you think is going to happen?
I think there's going to be an increasing reliance on manufactured water across particularly our urban systems. But if, like we talked about before, the hydrogen economy, if that becomes, if that grows the legs that it's promising to, the water needs of that will be huge. I think from how manufactured water gets used I thought about within the system, there's, we've got to think maybe a bit broader about what it means. On one hand, yes, it is a drought response, or it is a response to growing demand to address a supply-demand imbalance. But what are the opportunities that presents? So does that allow us to reduce our reliance on natural systems? Does that mean we can return more water to the environment or for cultural purposes? Does that mean, taking that to the nth degree, can we rewild some of our rivers by removing dams and things on it? Or where that's not possible because the dams are also fulfilling flood mitigation roles, increasing the flood protection of those dams by operating them lower so that, we supplement that lost supply with other sources. Within the minutiae of manufactured water, I think there's a piece that's needed by industry about regulations around recycled water. We've got the AGWR, which is very good about the recycled water guidelines. I think I got that acronym right. But ideally that needs to live in the ADWG, the Australian Drinking Water Guidelines, if we're thinking about it as a drinking resource, in my head at least. And then the other thing that's happening is, I guess to date in Australia, we've followed call it the Californian approach to treatment for recycled water, where it's membrane-based, reverse osmosis. It's a very effective barrier. It removes lots of things, like everything, down to salts, but it creates brine waste streams. It's relatively high energy use, approaching desalination energy. So is that the best way to do it? And then, the idea of using carbon-based treatment processes where we oxidize and use carbon filtration and then maybe an ultrafiltration type process before we disinfect, those kind of treatment trains, which are being used in some places internationally, seeing if they have merit in Australia, the Australian context. And when we do that, we need to think about, well, what do our regulators think about it? What's the risk profile from our wastewater catchments, but also, and as part of that, what's the salinity of the water then, and what are we trying to put this recycled water into?
I've been speaking with Peter Carroll, Service Line Leader, Water Treatment and Desalination at GHD. Thanks so much for your insights, Peter.
Thanks, Jo. It's been fun.